So here's another concept that you are going to have to start thinking about sometime pretty soon, and that is, if you live in a state, and most states I think do, recognize separate property. If you had some kind of assets before you got married, maybe you had an IRA or a 401k or a savings account, or maybe you even had a house. If you had that before you got married, in some states, in most states, that can be carved out of, not always, but there's a good chance you can carve that out of the amount of money that you have to share in the divorce process. But it's usually the responsibility of the person who's making a claim of separate property to prove that. And one way you can prove that is by getting old records. Now the challenge is, if you've been married for 10 or 20 years, it can be almost impossible to get records. But if you have records in your house that can prove what you had at the time you were married, that goes a long way to figuring out what you have to split with your husband when it comes time to do the final divorce papers. So other things that are sometimes considered separate property would be inheritance. If you've got an inheritance, that would maybe be your separate property. The challenge is sometimes people have like an IRA or a 401k they had before they got married, and then they get married and then they start adding to that retirement fund during the course of their marriage. And if you did that, in some states, that's called commingling your property. And if you've commingled your property, sometimes it can be difficult to prove what was your separate property, which you had before you got married, and what is your community or marital property. And like I said, I can't tell you exactly what the situation is in your state, but I can tell you from an issue spotting perspective that that's an issue that you need to think about. So that if you go to a lawyer, the lawyer might say, well, where did the down payment from the house come from? And if you say, my dad gave me $20,000 to put down on my house, that would be a clue to the lawyer of saying, oh, you might have a separate property interest in this marital home. Depends on your state, depends on the laws of your state. So you might want to take a few minutes and think about and start to put together a list of what you think you might have had that had value at the time that you got married. And then you might not be able to prove it right now today, but think about what you could use. Sometimes it's closing documents from a house, sometimes it's a bank record, sometimes it's a tax return where you can show that you got some interest on a certain account back a long time ago. So, and sometimes you attach things to your tax return that's good proof of what you had at the time that you got married. So I'm going to stop for just a second and let you think about what you might have that's separate property that might matter in your state as far as carving out some of the property that needs to be split as part of the divorce. Okay, so now you've got an idea, hopefully, of as much as you've been able to figure out about your assets and about your debts and about what might be in your state to be considered your separate property. And now you need to kind of take a breath and start educating yourself about the laws in your state. And the best way to do that is every state has some kind of statutes or some sort of guidance to the people who live in that state about how that state approaches the divorce process. So you can usually go online and go ahead and actually read the statutes or the code in your particular state if you can find it. And that kind of gives you an idea about how the court has to divide property and how things are solved on a temporary basis for you. Because the first thing that you have to face, and I'm not suggesting you should be your own lawyer and try to figure it all out, you've got to really educate yourself so that you can sort of be powerful about how you're going to approach this and take really good care of yourself. So the first thing that has to be decided is how you guys are going to live now that, say, he's moved out and you have whatever amount of money you have for two households, basically. And usually, if he's moved out, he's got himself an apartment or something, and you've got your budget for your family home, and maybe you were not the person who paid the bills, and maybe you were. If you weren't, you got to figure out real quickly what the bills are in your situation, and that's, I know it's really hard because you're upset and scared and you don't know what in the world is going on, and now you've got to come up with what your family budget is. So that's where you got to rely on your team and your lawyer to help you to figure out what amount of money you need on a monthly basis between now and the filing and the ultimate divorce. And that's sort of the temporary time period. And like I said, depends on the state and it depends on your situation, but it's anywhere from months to a year or more. So now you got to work on your budget. So what you have to do is figure out what you earn, and maybe you have a job like you're a nurse or in some sort of or you work in retail, or there's you have some sort of a job where you could actually take another shift or two if you need to. And you need to be honest with yourself and think about whether it's a good idea for you to take on another shift if you can, if you don't have enough money. So figure out what you make, and then figure out what you could make if you really had to. Figure out what your husband makes. Now you got to figure out how much, if you're still in the house or the apartment where you guys live, figure out what your bills are, and sometimes you might even know what they are. So you might have to, kind of rummage through the bank records and rummage through the file cabinet. So you've got to figure out what your rent or your mortgage payment is on a monthly basis. Then you've got utilities, you've got heat and electricity and water, sewer, garbage. Probably you have a cable bill, maybe a cell phone bill, telephone company. All of those bills, you've got to buy food, you might have to buy medication, you might have to pay for daycare for your children. There might be, activity fees for your kids, soccer matches, things like that. And we're not talking about, I need to go to Hawaii next week. We're talking about, what do I need to get by on a month-by-month basis while this is pending? So figure out what your budget is on a monthly basis, and then figure out if your husband has moved out, he might have moved into an apartment or something, and figure out what it's likely going to cost him to live. Because you've got to figure out how much money is available between the two of you. Like, you've got income and maybe you don't. And if you don't, then you're trying to figure out how much money he needs to pay you on a monthly basis, on a temporary basis, if that's part of the law in your state. He might pay you temporary alimony or maintenance, or he might just pay the mortgage and pay things directly. But at any rate, depends on how your jurisdiction, your state works. But come up with your budget and come up with what you think he's going to need to live on, and then you've got to take a really cold, hard look and see if you guys can afford what you can squeeze out of your budget. Because people come to me all the time and say, well, I don't want to change my lifestyle, and I have this really nice house, and I need to be able to, get my hair cut at this certain salon, or I got to get my nails done every couple weeks. And that might not be something that you can afford right now. And I don't mean to belittle those things, but you need to be very, very serious with yourself about what you can afford and what's going to be your lifestyle, at least during this temporary period. So you want to, in addition to looking at your income and your husband's income, is you want to look at, do you have any money in a savings account? Or do you have a stock portfolio that you could liquidate something? And I'm not saying you should, because in some states, once a divorce has been filed, there might be some kind of an order that's entered that says that you can't do that. But you need to find out what's available. So if you end up in court, you want to say, you know what, Your Honor, we can't pay our mortgage, but we've got some stock, and we could sell some of that stock to pay the bills, and then the court will make a determination as to whether you can do that or not. So I'm going to give you a minute to work on your budget, and we'll put some line items up to give you things to think about that are going to be part of your budget, so that you can really take a look at this with your friend or your team and your lawyer to figure out how you're going to live between the divorce and when the divorce is over. Because in another session, we're going to talk about a final settlement, but right now we're just talking about survival. We're talking about survival for the next many months, or maybe even up to a year, from a financial perspective.